like the president, I don't take any dollars from federal lobbyists. We ran a people-powered grassroots campaign of going out and talking to folks. So it was an exciting time. And I think some of it was a generation shift, you know, within the baby boomer generation. We hadn't really seen, while in our everyday communities, the boomers are doing such amazing stuff, often taking care of parents and kids at the same time. When it came to national leadership, there really had been a failure of sorts. People looking for sort of an instant gratification approach and kicking the problems down the road. And I think President Obama and myself got into this to take on the big challenges, not because they'd be easy. If they were easy, other people could have done them. But we wanted to come in and shake it up because we knew that America's competitiveness depended on it, that our solvency depended on it. You know, Medicare for senior citizens is an incredibly important promise we've made to our seniors. When we came into office, it was going to start going bankrupt in just 6-7 years. 6 or 7 years. Medicare. If we had done nothing, seniors would be 6 years away right now from that program starting to become insolvent. And we said, no, we're not going to let that happen. We are not going to let our seniors down. We're going to go in, we're going to make some tough decisions, and we're going to do it to make sure Medicare is there for seniors, to make sure doctors stay in the Medicare system, and to get rid of the nickel and diming of our seniors by reducing those copays and reducing those prescription drug costs. Those were the sorts of things that made us want to get into this in the first place, I think.
Did you ever think at any point, did you ever feel like you were David going up against Goliath at any point during that election?
Oh, sure. I certainly felt that in my congressional race. But I also felt it with the approach I've taken in Congress. By not taking money from lobbyists, immediately the whole town gets very tense for all of the tension between the two parties. They really agree on often protecting a certain amount of the status quo and protecting the powerful. When you come up, and you're like, I wasn't kidding in the campaign when I said we need to clean up Washington. I'm going to come and do it. We're going to challenge the earmark process. I'm going to challenge Chairman Murtha and Rangel and others for ethics violations. I'm going to call that out. That's not the way that the inside the Beltway thing runs. And I think the president as well shook some of that up, some of the assumptions. So, what I see, I think, is that both parties tend to pick sort of good-looking guys who are not going to challenge them and are not going to rock the boat and are going to be happy to just stay where they are. Frankly, I think Senator Hurt's done that for 10 years in Richmond. And if there's one thing I've learned in politics, it's that if you take a go-along-to-get-along approach, it always protects the powerful, because that's the path of least resistance in politics, protect the powerful. To do what I'm doing, which is to challenge the powerful to protect and fight for everyday folks, that takes 10 times as much work.
And how do you convince your constituents that that is what you're doing? I'm sure your opponent would say, well, that's what I'm doing. I mean, how do you convince your voters that what you just said is really going to happen when we've seen often, Tom, it not be the case?
Well, I think that people who show up at events and get to know what we're doing and get the facts, I don't have to do any spin. They just get it. But in the absence of people getting engaged and getting information, if they just listen to the ads, which are of course paid for and sponsored by the powerful, they're going to get a very different impression of what's going on. And I think people are smart and they're decent and they understand when very powerful interest groups are trying to spin them, and that's what's been going on. That's why you see polls all coming back in our direction. Yes, people aren't satisfied with what we've done, and they have some real concerns. But at the end of the day, they understand that the other side got us in this mess. And more importantly than that, they haven't changed their ways. They put out a pledge for America that repeated all of the mistakes that got us into this mess. I'm not someone who wants to look backwards and point the finger, except to the extent that it makes sure we learn lessons not to repeat that. And that's the unfortunate thing we're seeing on the other side.
Okay, and Virginia is considered a pretty conservative state, correct?
I think of it as an independent state, but sure.
Independent, okay. Well, it went from, and I'm not professing to be this genius when it comes to politics, so help me. So in 2008, it went from being what they called a red state to a blue state. Is that right?
For the first time since the Civil Rights Act passed, the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, had supported a Republican for president since the Civil Rights Act. And then in 2008, for the first time in many years, it went blue. It went for the Democrat, Barack Obama, for president.
What caused that shift? What caused voters to say, I'm not going to re-elect Virgil Goode? I'm going to go, because you had people, obviously, who historically voted Republican and voted Democrat. What caused that shift in 08?
Well, I think it was a couple of things. I think the Republican agenda had really played out to its logical extension in the Bush years, and it had been a disaster for this country. We saw almost no job growth outside the financial sector during that entire period. And then we realized that the job growth in the financial sector had all been a house of cards and fell apart, which meant we basically lost a decade of economic growth and competitiveness. Also, the tough work Bill Clinton had done to balance the budget in the 90s was something that finally had gotten us onto a path of some solvency, and the Republicans had taken us off all of that. And a lot of conservatives said, well, I'm a conservative because I believe in fiscal responsibility, but Bill Clinton balanced the budget, Mark Warner balanced the budget, and George Bush didn't. So if I'm a conservative, maybe that aligns more with the Democratic side of the equation. And I think, when you see people who care basically about responsibility and accountability, they weren't seeing that. They didn't necessarily feel it with the President Bush having a strategy for Iraq and Afghanistan that put people in harm's way, as well as the issues with the economy. So, I think that one issue was that a lot of folks who had leaned a little more Republican went the other way. The second issue, to be honest, is that elections in the simplest term are decided by who shows up. And not the same people show up for every election. And I think what you saw with the 2008 year was that some people were more excited on the, not just the Democratic side, but specifically Barack Obama and myself. You had young people, for example, get involved who don't normally get very involved.
That's true.
Certainly a lot of enthusiasm in the African-American community. But in our district, the African-American vote was not up as historically as some expected, but young voter turnout was. So sometimes groups get particularly excited. If you look at the governor's race last year, a lot of people, those same people just decided not to show up. Right. It wasn't that they all became McDonald voters, though some did. It was that a lot of them said, I'm not going to show up this year. And I think that's going to be one of the most important factors this year is who shows up. And so, there's been a lot of talk and speculation, but really it's all just talk and speculation. The only poll that matters is Election Day. I think if everybody in my district showed up, who could vote, showed up and voted, we'd win this thing no problem. If you look at the difference between, registered voters and likely voters, I mean, we win this thing in a walk if every registered voter shows up. The question is who actually does show up, and that's, that's up to people. And in a democracy, you get the government you deserve. And so we'll see how that plays out.
What does the areas does the 5th District cover?
It's huge. It's 9,000 square miles. So it actually goes north of Charlottesville up to Greene. Goes about 2.5 hours south to the North Carolina border in Danville. But then it also goes east to west, all the way over to Martinsville. Doesn't have the city of Roanoke, but it has various counties around it. Goes east towards Richmond, not to Richmond, but includes Prince Edward, Mecklenburg, Brunswick County, some of the Fluvanna, Brunswick, et cetera. So, you really have, it almost looks like a maple leaf through the center. And it's a really cool district to represent, in part because it's got a lot of history, Madison, Jefferson, et cetera. I mentioned before, you have Revolutionary War, Civil Rights Movement, a lot of history. We have, for example, a bluegrass heritage trail through parts of the district. We have a tobacco heritage trail that really drove the economy of the state for a long time. We have the Civil Rights Heritage Trail, the Moton Museum in Farmville, where they shut down the schools for years rather than integrate. The people who are part of that are still there. They're in the community, and they're trying to make sure that history is understood and that we continue to push forward with the principles of equality and fairness. But it's also economically very diverse because the Charlottesville area is generally doing pretty well. You have the town of Lynchburg's out, but the counties around it, again, pretty diverse economic base. Farmville is a great, college town. Southern part of the district has been on very tough times, lost a lot of jobs since NAFTA. in textiles, in
Martinsville,
furniture,
that area?
In Martinsville,
yeah.
exactly. 18, 20% unemployment, even higher at certain moments. And, that's where we spend a lot of time looking at how to help America outcompete India and China. There's no shortcut. We have to have a competitiveness strategy. But even in Charlottesville, we have to remember, as well off as this community is, nearly 1 in 4 residents live below the poverty line.
Absolutely.
So, is it even affordable to live here anymore? What are the kind of jobs that someone can support a working class family on? What's the kind of housing that's going to be part of that? So I think even within, our own community here in Charlottesville, we see a tremendous diversity of challenges in trying to understand on transportation, electric grid technology, construction, manufacturing, how we can try to create the job opportunities for those who have been more chronically underemployed or unemployed within our city.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about your faith, which is something you are open about, and how it plays into politics. Do you vote on your convictions typically?
I do. I want to share those convictions with my constituents. I want to make the case, and I will.
Does it work?
It does. I think you can't do it if you expect that you're going to be heralded as a saint in every community. I think if you've suggested a form of leadership that says, hey, I owe people my best judgment, I owe them my ears and listening, and on any given issue, my constituents are not going to agree with each other, and it's not just Republican, Democrat. We have mostly independents in the district. Some lean more right or left, some are more libertarian, some are more religious right-oriented, et cetera. So you just have a mix, a very large mix of ideas. For me, I think the best kind of politics is where you listen, you reach a conclusion based on everything you hear of what you think is right for your area, you do the best job possible of communicating that to folks, and then you let the chips fall where they may. My father, said to me when I got into this that I should always remember that Judgment Day is more important than Election Day. And so I do think that you want to try to have that sense of right and wrong. Now, if that sense of right and wrong is particularly out of step with your constituents, then that's probably a natural disconnect. It's also true, though, in politics, more than in my old life, that the lines are not always as black and white. In legislation, you're often dealing with, say, what if I like 90% of a bill? What if I like 70% of a bill? What if I've done everything I can to make it as strong as possible, and it's still not where I like? What is, that's a different kind of calculus, whereas in my old work, whether it was, peace negotiations in West Africa or security analysis in Afghanistan, it was pretty clear who the good guys and bad guys were. And it was a matter of putting a strategy for stability on the table. And so, it is an interesting place to test that idea of conviction. And so far, I feel like I can keep my head held high, but, I think it is something that eats away at someone over time.